Welcome and thanks for joining me on Talk the Walk. I'm Sarah Wong. Earlier, leaders from over 100 countries have gathered in Glasgow to make ambitious promises to limit temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Scottish city has become the breaking ground of global commitment to end deforestation, cut methane emissions, and phase out the use of coal. What are those pledges mean for energy consumption in the future? Today, we're joined by a member of the British Parliament, Mr. Chris Skidmore from London. He is also Britain's former energy and climate change minister. Mr. Skidmore, it's my pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you for the invitation. Much appreciated.
As climate change minister, you helped secure COP26 for the United Kingdom and signed the UK commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions into law in 2019. Tell us whether the ambition to control global warming is out of step with the realistic need for fossil fuels and alongside with nations' self-interests.
That's right. So 2 years ago, I signed into legislation a law that made the United Kingdom the first G7 country to commit to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And since then, we've seen, I think, now and right up to COP26 with India, obviously putting a net zero commitment to 2070. That's 80% of the world's surface now have committed to net zero carbon emissions around the middle of this century. Now, we know that from the UNCCC report, United Nations Committee on Climate Change report, that we need to hit net zero if we've got a 50% chance of keeping emissions increases around 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, it is absolutely key that we make those commitments. What I would say, and I have a report that is being published at COP26 as part of my work with public policy projects, is that we do need to be realistic about delivering on net zero, that we can't have a rush straight towards renewables, that we can't decarbonize overnight. But what that does mean is taking a strategic look at those hard to abate sectors first. It's all too easy, I think, to go for sometimes what we call the low hanging fruit, and thinking that you'll be able to achieve net zero by wind and solar alone. And that simply won't be the case, because if we're going to decarbonize our economies, we also need our economies to grow in order to ensure that the infrastructure can be funded to be able to decarbonize. So there's this paradox here. Actually, we're going to need twice as much electricity and energy by 2050 as we produce now. The population's growing from around 7 billion to 10 billion by 2050. So we've got to make sure that when we look at net zero carbon emissions, it's also net zero growth. And that's incredibly important, which is why you can't phase out the use of fossil fuels overnight. It's simply impossible. But what you can do is begin to make real terms reductions now by looking at some of those really heavy emitters. We know about coal, but I think also international shipping, areas where maybe electricity generation isn't going to touch, but you've got the opportunity to use synthetic fuels or hydrogen to gradually begin to make a difference in reducing those emissions.
Now, I am very glad that you bring up the pragmatism in the framework of global decarbonization. Now, some governments, including China's, think that the Glasgow summit is only to iron out the details, the nitty-gritty, under the framework that was laid out 6 years ago in Paris. And how should we measure Glasgow's success? And how do policymakers and negotiators bring pledges to fruition amid the differentiated objectives within individual governments?
So that's right. Glasgow is meant to be putting down the final details of what was laid out in Paris. And we know from Paris back in 2015 that commitments were made. But I think it's really important to make a distinction between what was agreed at Paris and what has now been committed to at Glasgow. In Paris in 2015, there was a commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by the end of the century, by 2100. And now, so we've gone 50 years closer, and we know so much more in terms of the data about actually the threat of climate change and the process by which the warming seems to be increasing. I think even if you going back to 2015 and you talked about the wildfires and the potential heat waves that have been happening, we would recognize the more immediate impacts of climate change. But I think what Glasgow has shown is that there have been particular areas of focus now within the overall discussion and framework. So firstly, methane. We know that methane is 56 times more powerful than carbon dioxide at warming the planet. So there's been this global pledge on methane. If we can reduce our methane emissions now, that's going to make a significant impact. Apparently, a quarter of all global warming is due to methane. So there's been commitments on methane that are specific. There's been commitments on phasing out the use of coal. That's been very specific. When I was a minister, we had the Powering Past Coal Alliance that was signed up to by about 20 countries. And now that alliance has grown to nearly around 150. So there's been a almost universal commitment to phasing out coal. And I think that we've also seen this commitment on forests. I mean, commitments on reforestation and preventing deforestation have been made in the past, but now we have sort of clear commitments from Brazil in a way that wasn't there in the past. So I think in specific areas, Glasgow is now colouring in this framework. It was drawn, and now we can now actually see it, and we can realistically deliver on these numbers.
Interesting. I mean, to deliver those pledges, those ambitious promises, it's hard even under one consistent government. And you mentioned Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, and in India, China, those developing nations, they were making substantial promises to help tackle climate change, such as Brazil chipping in the efforts to end or prevent deforestation. But what happened after those countries have a change of government? Your U.S. President Joe Biden, he openly apologized for the previous administration's handling of the Paris Climate Accord. So I was wondering, is there any mechanism or guardrail, so to speak, in place to minimize, if not stop, the flip-flopping of countries' climate policies?
I think you're absolutely right, and it's a point well made. I have a senior fellowship at Harvard where I'm looking at this whole process of Mission Zero at the moment, and we talk about an emissions gap, the progress that we have made versus the reality of what's going to happen if we don't deliver on commitments, and that emissions gap has grown. It's 28 years until we get to 2050, but we've had 31 years of empty promises since the first UN declaration that climate change was happening, back in Kyoto. And so I would say that there is also an accountability gap as well as an emissions gap. There is now a term I've heard called NIMTO, not in my term of office. And you're right, up until 2050, there will be 7 presidential elections with all the uncertainty that involves. So what are the potential reforms that I think are needed to this process? We have every 5 years an ambition COP. So Glasgow is the next ambition COP since Paris. We can't afford, I think, to wait until another ambition COP in 2026. I think we need to have annual emissions statements so that every single UN climate change committee that meets annually should be referring back to what progress has been made. And actually, the report I'm publishing on Monday for Public Policy Projects, which I've called Maximising COP, one of the areas that we look at is actually what Australia has been doing, because they are now publishing annual emissions reduction statements that are based on their low emissions technologies. And I think that is a good model by which all countries should look about reporting real time annually what difference they have made today, rather than promising change tomorrow.
Interesting. We'll touch on Australia after the break when we discuss the future of hydrogen and other alternative energy source. But before I let you go before the break, now your Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the COP26 summit in Glasgow is a turning point of humanity. Do you think we are farther from a climate catastrophe than we were a week ago?
So I think the commitments that have been made just keep us within reach of 1.5 degrees. I mean, even 1.5 degrees is only a 50% sort of probability that it will make a difference. We just need a whole of society, a whole of a globe approach to making a difference. And for myself, that means not castigating high carbon economies. We need to work with those countries. It's no fault of their own that they historically may have economies based on fossil fuels. And so making sure that this is based on outcomes rather than ideology is the most important thing that Glasgow can deliver.
Interesting. That's when, the real negotiations kick in. Talk the Walk will be back in a moment. Don't go away.